I'm from the Center for Economic and Social Rights, and it is an honor for me to be able to moderate this panel on a crucial and very current debate for the region in the midst of the multiple crises that it is going through because of these times of pandemic that have led to a setback or into a lack of 2 decades in the fight against extreme poverty and an unprecedented increase of new and old inequalities. The topic that we will be addressing is debt and the way debt increase is being used to impose austerity measures in several countries throughout the region that have had devastating impacts on human rights in the recent history of many countries, such as Ecuador and Brazil's cases. There is a crisis of debt. Is it really? What can be expected in the near future? Is tax austerity the only way? These are some of the questions that we will be addressing during the session. This week, we have celebrated the launch of Principles of Human Rights in Tax Policy that are proposing several aspects in terms of debt. The principles show that one of the failures of international cooperation that prevents progressive warranty of rights, especially in global systemic global crises, just as the one we're going through, is the absence of measures on behalf of the international levels in order to prevent tax restrictions. In this context, organizations as the Human Rights Commission has made a call to action to prevent tax modifications that could stop countries to address human rights. All of this makes necessary a tax policy reform that asks for all of the parties to be involved and address the subjacent and underlying aspects of sovereign debt, providing more room for countries to invest in guaranteeing human rights and sustainable development. In order to go over this topic, we have a luxury panel that I'm going to introduce in a moment. And I would like to also welcome Reggae Dow, that's going to do a graphic report of this event, and we will see at the end of this event. Now I would like to introduce our panel members. I have the honor to introduce Daniel Monevar. He is the Senior Official of Policies and Incidents in Debt, Justice of Debt. Also, Elizabeth Ortiz. She's Director of Social Global Action for Columbia University. We also have Patricia Miranda, Director of Global Incidents. And last but not least, we have Juana Sotomayor. She's Official of Human Rights of the Subdivision of Special Procedures of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, Office for Human Rights. So we will start with Daniel, and he will be discussing debt and vulnerability that causes a pandemic of debt. So please go ahead. Thank you, Sergio. Thank you for allowing me to participate in this event. So time is short, so I'm going to go directly to the point. As Sergio mentioned, this presentation is based on the report prepared that's called Debt Pandemic. This report is only available in English. However, in a couple of weeks, it is going to be available in Spanish, hopefully. And I think that the context of this discussion has to be around the guiding principles on debt and human rights that have been approved by Human Rights Councils of the United Nations. These guiding principles establish a series of obligations that the states have to meet in terms of human rights. And to this, we established, destined the maximum amount of available resources to carry out progressive improvement of social and cultural rights, as well as economic of these citizens. And in the pandemic context, one of the main problems that developing countries and emerging countries are facing is that debt is reducing the amount of resources that the states have at their disposal in order to guarantee those population rights. And the problem is that the discussion of the relationship between debt, tax policy, and human rights is introduced in a context where there are two main elements On one side, we have tax irresponsibility. This means that debt problems are defined by problems in the management of tax policy and the debt of countries, of emerging countries. Second, that the problems that we are seeing right now in terms of debt were caused by the pandemic. However, if we go to the numbers, we see a very different story. The first thing we need to see is that debt has been increasing in a substantial manner throughout the last decade. Since 2011, debt of emerging countries as an average has increased from 40.2 to 62.3% of the GDP. And around a fourth of this, $1.9 billion has happened as a result of the pandemic. In this interactive graph, we can see how it has progressed during this last decade, how debt has increased during this last decade simultaneously in all regions. It is important to stress that in 2000 and then from 2020 to 2021, debt increased in 108 in 16 countries where we have available data in terms of public debt. This means that it is not an isolated phenomenon that's related to an irresponsible management or related directly to the pandemic. Of course, if debt increases, then its service increases, interest payment. And this is a very typical story and similar one. If we see public debt service in emerging countries, this has tripled between 2011 and 2020. So 6.6% of government income has gone to 17.4 between 2011 and 2020. In the last year, 32 countries have assigned at least 20% of states' income to paying public debt. And as I said, this is a very similar image. So if we can see throughout the last decade, we see how there is an increase on the debt service as a percentage of a government income, where there is in Middle East and North of Africa and North of Africa, where they are also allocating significant number of public money to public debt payment. And why is this important? Well, if more resources are allocated to paying debt, then less resources are available to guarantee the rights of the population. We can talk about the right to education, the right to housing. But in this case, since we are going through a pandemic, it's logical to focus on the impact on debt on public health. And what we see is that for emerging countries, for 116 of them, public debt service represented 1.6 times the resources allocated to health. This means that for each dollar allocated to public health, emerging countries were destined $1.6 to the service of external debt. And this is a similar image in all of the regions. For example, in sub-Saharan Africa, countries destined twice more resources to paying debt than to health, to public health. And the most concerning aspect of this is that it is an indicator that has been deteriorating throughout the last decade. While in 2011, there were 31 emerging countries that destined more resources to paying debt than public health, in 2020, this number has doubled. We have 62 emerging countries that are allocating more resources to debt than to public education, which is, of course, counterproductive in the context of a pandemic. If we go to the specific case of Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa, the problems that we're seeing in our countries to face the pandemic come from a problem of systematic disinvestment in public services throughout the last 10 years. This means that the problems that we're seeing are caused by a structural problem in the management of public policies and the lack of investment in public health systems. And what has been the multilateral response facing this concerning scenario? Well, it has been a non-sufficient multilateral response. The main multilateral initiative that has been created was suspending the debt service to the G20, the TSSI. And this allows for low-income countries to suspend for 2 years debt payment. However, if we compare what's allowed to be suspended to what developing countries have been paying, is an abysmal comparison. Suspension only allows for these low-income countries to suspend $5.3 billion, while in this same period, emerging countries have destined $372 million or billion dollars to paying the debt. This means that the multilateral response is clearly inadequate. And why is this a problem? This is related to the resource transfer, which is a comparison of how many resources those countries receive via new credits against the resources that they send to their debtors. And we see what happened in 2020 according to the World Payments. While emerging countries received $178 billion in new credits, at the same time, they paid $372 million to their debtors. This means that the public sector of the emerging countries, in the midst of a pandemic, they sent to their creditors $194 billion. So when we talk about the country's problems to mobilize enough resources to protect their population, then we acquire vaccines. And these discussions need to happen in the context of a massive transference of resources, because resources are there. What it means is that we are using it differently as we shouldn't be. And that's the net transference, a negative transfer in 58 countries. In the case of Latin America, Latin American countries destined, how much time do I have left? Sorry, Sergio, 2 minutes. Okay, perfect, I'm wrapping up. So they destined $143 billion to pay in debt, and they conveyed in net terms $68 billion. So what's the problem here? Without support to solve the problem, the only solution that emerging countries have is cutting back significantly public spending. I'm going to skip this because I know that this is going to be presented by Isabel. But I want to show you a very interesting image, which is, while in 2019 there were 4 countries in the region that had programs with the IATB, this with the International Monetary Fund, this has started happening since 2019. And the problem is that the IMF programs do not include considerations in terms of human rights. So they just take into account macroeconomic and tax situations. And what's concerning in this sense is that those programs will turn into the framework that will receive the implementation of austerity policies at a regional level. In this context, what we're seeing in the Colombian case is that tensions created by the pandemic substantially reduce the tax maneuver margin that governments have to implement those adjustment policies. And what's important, and with this I conclude, is that we need to develop a different framework to analyze this type of policies. Civil society has shown in the United Nations framework a series of proposals to face the crisis that start from a very simple idea, which is that the crisis that we are going through right now is mainly a public health crisis. If we do not solve this public health crisis, we won't be able to solve economic and tax crisis that we are also facing. And for this, we need to have, first of all, or we need to prioritize, first of all, the protection of rights and lives of people, not only in Latin America, but also in the entire emerging world. And that's that. Thank you so much, Daniel. It's a great framework for further presentations. Without any further ado, I'd like to pass the floor to Isabella. She will talk about Austerity Global Alert that they have worked on. And with this, We will also discuss less aggressive actions than a tax policy would mean. Thank you so much, Sergio. It's an honor to be with you today. And I have a presentation because an image is worth more than 1,000 words. So let me see. Well, this presentation corresponds to a work that we've been doing, which is a global austerity alert. And this is the updated map of what Daniel was presenting. This is the number of countries that will cut back public spending in terms of the GDP this year and next year. This is an estimate. And as you can see, this is a tsunami of austerity cutbacks. So information is based on fiscal projections that the IMF economists are using, which is public access information, in terms of perspectives of world economics in 2020. And well, basically, this means that by next year, 85% of the world's population, more than 6,000 million people, will be suffering from this austerity. So what has happened? Well, two very similar answers. If we see tax trends of countries in the financial crisis of 2008-2009 and the current one, this graph shows the number of countries that are contracting public spending in the GDP. The first year that you saw here is 2008-2009, and then as you can see, there is very little countries right now that are cutting back. But in 2010, a lot of countries, more than 100, started cutting down, and this came after the world financial crisis. And now this adjustment decade prolonged from 2010 to 2019. And the two bars indicate that is the high-income countries, and the darker ones is the emerging countries. These are 192 total countries in the world. And what I'm saying here is that austerity was thought to be an European problem, but no. Austerity was more prevalent in the emerging world, and they were more aggressive even. But the thing is that they didn't make it to headlines. So as of 2010 until 2019, there was a very significant austerity cutbacks. And we also see a very small bar corresponding to 2020 with virtually no country cutback. Everyone increased spending by a minimum 5.5% of the GDP. So this year, austerity cutbacks will start. And it's estimated that 154 countries, out of which 53 are high income and 101 are emerging countries, will start cutting back public spending. And next year we will have more, 159. So this trend will continue until 2025. So this means that it has a tsunami of austerity cutbacks if we don't do something. And these are IMF's projections that reflect their thinking. That does not mean that it will happen. It's an orthodox thinking, and that's the way they're considering it. But there are alternatives as we will discuss. These are some of the numbers that we've seen. So what is the exact cutbacks? We don't know, but we do know which have happened in the last decade, from 2010 to 2020. And in order to analyze these, we went over 779 reports of IMF's countries, and the most common reforms were eliminating subsidies and grants for fuels, food, and agriculture in 132 countries, despite record prices that were for food happened there. There were also roofs or cutbacks to public officials' wages in 130 countries. This means reducing or topping the wages and the number of public officials workers providing essential services to the population, such as education, health, water, whatever. And this is fundamental for human rights because these are critical areas. The third typical measure, and here we have to be also very attentive to this because this is what possibly an orthodox way we see that it's going to happen in the next 5 years. The third type of measure that was taken was rationalizing and focalizing social assistance, which is the safety nets. This happened in more than 100 countries in a moment where they should be expanding social protection, not focalizing it only to poorest and leaving uncovered a lot of vulnerable population that could be low income or even middle class. That many times in emerging countries, middle classes have very low incomes, and they should be receiving the right support. And the fourth type of resources that they want to take is the reforms of pensions and social security. And so many reforms have been done in this last decade. We've seen that the OECD shows that pension holders will receive lower pensions, and this will cause poverty in older adults, which has to be solved. Other type of measures is work flexibilization that we've seen in 89 countries, reducing work and social protection. And there has been reforms in health in 89 countries. And this is unlikely to happen in the future because if something has been seen by the pandemic, that we need to increase spending in health. So probably this won't happen. And in terms of collection, what has been seen in the previous decades was a huge increase of the VAT in consumption of basic services, which is a regressive policy that shouldn't be adopted. And then privatization that we've seen, some increases in more than 60 countries. So all of these policies were not necessary last decade, and they are not necessary in the next decade. So all of these austerity ones have increased poverty and especially inequality, particular women, and they have undermined progress in human rights and caused social conflict. And this is a graph of another work that's measuring austerity measures, and they started as of 2010. The number of protests started rising facing austerity cutbacks, and they have been held until last year. So reality here is that decisions on spending and funding affect the lives of millions of people. And they cannot be taken only by technocrats of the Ministry of Economy or the IMF or the banks, because these decisions have to be taken in a national public discussion and dialogue and conversation, because this is the way they will have the support of the population. And what are the alternatives that we have in terms of funding? Well, actually, austerity is not necessary in any country. There are funding options that are virtually in all of the countries of the world, all the way to the poorer people, and we don't have time to elaborate. However, I'm going to at least mention them so that we can start a discussion on this. The 8 options that we have are completely approved by the UN and by the international financial institutions, and they have been implemented by many countries in the last decades. Hence, this is about people working in the ministry, the different ministries or technicians that can advise them need to consider these options that exists in all of the countries. Every country may have a different combination. So 8 of them. The first one is increasing tax income. There are many types of incomes: consumption, import, export, natural resources extraction. What we need to prevent are consumption incomes, taxes that tend to be regressive, that combine a rich person with a poor person. Now we need to try to center on progressive taxes. For example, the personal, corporations, including the financial sector, that in general does not pay taxes or pay very little taxes. And we have very good examples of all of this. For example, Brazil, there was a tax on financial transactions for 15 years that paid the extension of Social Security. And when a conservative government came, it was eliminated, but it was properly implemented. A second option, which is very important for human rights and for social protection, is expanding the coverage of social security and formalize workers that are working in informal jobs with good contracts. We've seen this in an amount of countries that have increased a lot coverage of social security, for example, Argentina, Brazil, Tunisia, or the next one is eliminating illegal economic flows such as money laundering, tax evasion, which are illegal, and hence they should be eliminated. Fourth, which is one of the topics that Daniel has mentioned, which is reducing or restructuring debt. And we have very good examples of countries that have done it in the more than 60 countries actually in the last years. For example, Ecuador or Iceland. And for those countries that are low-income countries, they can receive more aid for social development, for example, appealing to the Social Protection Global Fund. But middle-income countries, this is not an option. Then using tax reserves and foreign currency, for example, Chile and Norway, they've done it. Then using a macroeconomic framework that's more flexible. And this means tolerance to certain inflation or tax deficit. But this is not fundamental. Fundamental is socioeconomic development. And then we have reallocating public spending, replacing high costs spending and low social impact, for example, defense. And we have very good cases and examples. Costa Rica, Thailand, they used defense expenses in health. And if you are more interested in receiving more information, there is a page that's called Millennium Sustainable Goals. This is an ILO work that's backed by the UN. And all of these options are very feasible in many countries. So the combination is going to be different. Each country will have their own combination, but all of the countries have options. So austerity is not unavoidable. And what's clear is that these options need to be discussed in a social dialogue. This shouldn't be taken in behind closed doors. And I have one last slide. And it reads, what to do. This is being discussed from tax policy, but what can a citizen do, a regular citizen do? There is a world campaign against austerity that's called No More Austerity, No Más Austeridad. You can look at it yourselves. And this shows what we can do as citizens. 5 options mainly. First, if your government is cutting back on public spending or not. And for this, you can see the attachment. Oxfam has a very good database, or also the last reports of the IMF. So if the country is cutting back public spending, which is very probable, because this year 154 countries will, we need to articulate the alternative demands for socioeconomic recovery from the pandemic. For example, an increase of budget in education, social protection, water, etc., to meet our human rights. Third, we need to call to a national discussion and dialogue. It has to be done quickly and has to be related to the budget. It cannot be done in a year. It has to be done expedite so that it can have a true impact. And for this, we have to carry out like a very quick assessment of social impact of different options and funding alternatives, to see which social impact it will have. For example, if it doesn't use consumption tax, then they are regressive and they will generate more inequality potentially than if you put other type of progressive taxes to corporations, financial sector, etc. And last but not least, we have to agree the proper policies with social representatives, union representatives, and this has to be public and national. These decisions are very important and they affect the lives of millions of people, and they cannot be made back behind closed doors. Thank you very much. Thank you, Isabel. The message is clear. Austerity is not an option. There are alternatives. And with this, I would like to introduce Patricia Miranda. And she's going to talk to us about Latin Dad Agenda. in order to invite international community to create debt restructuring efforts to face the liquidity restrictions. So, Patricia, please, you have 10 minutes. Thank you so much, Sergio. I'm so glad to be able to share this with friends and great colleagues. I'm going to talk about the situation of debt in the region and some proposals from Latin America and from Latindad. So I would like to start by quoting the UN in a recent document where they refer that Latin America is one of the regions that has been affected the most by the pandemic. And I will read very quickly. Latin American economy was contracted, as we all know, in almost 8%. Almost 3 million companies closed down in 2020 because of the pandemic. But also the region registered close to 28% of the total deaths due to COVID, despite our territory having only 80.4% of the world's population. So this situation, of course, we are going through it, we are seeing it in our countries, and we see how poverty came with a slight trend to increase in the red line, but projections for 2020 show there is an increase of poverty. And this has topped the per capita GDP. In our countries and in our regions, how have they received the pandemic in economic terms? And here we can see that our income and tax collection particularly has been reducing. We see this on the red with the red line, and there was a very significant reduction in 2020. All of the sectors, all of the economy sectors paid for this, and we see that at the same time government expenses are increasing because of all of the reasons that we have heard in previous presentations. But we can also see that in previous years, there was a tax cap. We see a difference between our income and our expenses that's more and more or deeper and deeper as of the pandemic. And this gap is growing, and all of the countries in the region already had a tax deficit before the pandemic. Some 2 years, others 6 years in a row. And in 2020, when we received the pandemic, the only option was increasing debt. As you can see, Latin American debt of all of the countries has had a growing trend in the last years. But you can see here that in 2020, there was an important jump in every case, in every country, they increased their debt. They increased their debt with sovereign bonds issuance, others through credits of the IMF. We saw that in different presentations, 62% of support through IMF credit has been destined to Latin America, but also through internal debt. In this graph, we can see the gross debt, and we can see what are the most indebted ones by the domestic debt. We can see Brazil, Argentina, El Salvador, Costa Rica, but we also see Bolivia, Ecuador, Colombia, and Mexico that are virtually reaching 70% of their debt in terms of the GDP. There are other countries, as we can see here, that have a debt rate that is lower. All of them have the same trend, this jump to increase this debt, that in current conditions and in very little possibility to recover quickly in terms of income and with needs to increase spending, it's probable that this trend will continue increasing afterwards. And I want to very quickly show you here in this graph the composition of the of the external debt, where we see that private sector is in blue. For many countries, is one of the most important creditors. And in orange, we see multilateral creditors. both type of creditors have not proven or shown a lot of will in this context of a pandemic in terms of maybe having some agreement on the debt at a global and at a region level. And something that I was mentioning before, and that's important to add, in the composition of domestic debt, of public debt, is the participation of domestic debt that we can see in turquoise or blue, which is higher than the foreign debt. And not because of this, it will be less concerning. And I will readdress it later on. We believe that there are false solutions for a recovery. Daniel already mentioned it. It's already in the initiative of suspending the debt service by incorporating an initiative which is the common framework. And first of all, in any of the two cases, it will benefit region countries. And virtually all of the countries in the region are considered as medium income with a GDP per capita calculation that hides other vulnerabilities and realities. So Latin America is out of these initiatives, both of them. So this is one of the calls that we've been doing from Latindad in terms of middle income countries that show inequalities. Latin America is still the most unequal region in the world, and the initiatives are still prioritizing the ability to pay the debt. And it could be that in many countries they can still pay their debt. They have a capacity to do so, the ability to do so. However, in a context that we are in the pandemic and of multiple crises, is of course at an expense of something. Is this capacity to do it at an expense of not being to increase spending, social protection, health. So this, of course, is causing a lot of problems in this context, and it is quite notorious. And we also have the criteria that are being addressed. Our countries have a series of vulnerabilities besides paying the debt, and that are not being taken into account. So our current needs and our current realities show that we need liquidity, we need a tax space that was already reduced before the pandemic came, and we need to destine more resources to health, to vaccine access, and in previous meetings of the IMF, we saw some information showing that our region was one that stopped the most in terms of education. And we also have a series of options, we have online classes, and in Latin America, of course, we have that these children or these young people can have further opportunities, not only for higher education levels, but also higher access of a better access for a better job. There are a series of economic vulnerabilities, social and climate, as we've seen at the end of last year in Central America, that are not being taken into account in possible programs or support packages in Latin American countries, beside debt and credits that we always have as almost last resort. And we also have the matter of liquidity, long term, so solvency, because these measures are short term, but we cannot rely on measures that, even added to a possible rebound effect, will bring solutions that last more than 1 or 2 years. We need a recovery that's truly sustainable in medium and long term. And last but not least, we need to go back to the 2030 agenda or our own development national plans that are not being met, or even worse, have had some setbacks. The agenda or the proposals that we are offering are delaying of debt, and this is an initiative with Latinidad members that are in conversations with other countries and their own countries and sub-regional bodies in order to ask for an extension to the debt. And while this generates tax space for these countries that have been recently affected by 2 hurricanes that had never happened so close one another. So maybe they can work in a restructuring process of this debt. We are also talking about a debt cancellation that could be binding to all of the creditors. It could be even the debt service for some years while a restructuring mechanism for the debt is being created. It has to be a process that's of benefit for low-income countries, but also for middle-income countries. We saw on the graphs that we have 7 countries that have reach more than 70% of the debt in terms of the GDP, and others tend to rise. So with a restructuring mechanism or renegotiation that's fair, it's going to be very important for these to be considered as their only alternative. At the same time, we consider the need to have access to liquidity. And of course, this is going to be through ambitious debt restructuring and also changes of DEG laws that would be equivalent to $20 million. The decision that has already been taken that it's going to be approved, in process to be approved, is $150,000 million. So in any way, this is going to be an input and a way to channel resources, a very important one for developed countries. It's going to be the main support for middle-income countries right now. However, we also assess that it has been insufficient and that it's not going to be a support midterm and long-term that our countries will need for their recovery. Our countries also, besides the special drawing rights, they need also the concessionary funding because we all have to have access to this. And considering to the drawing, we have the voluntary transfer of the special drawing rights. So in developed countries, they won't have the need to use these special drawing rights that are assigned to them. Hence, we're talking about a transfer, a volunteer, a willing transfer for these special drawing rights towards emerging countries that needs these resources. It is important to keep the spirit of these special drawing rights and not for them to turn into a mechanism that generates a new wave of debt or a costful debt or a debt with austerity conditions or austerity terms or tax austerity, which is what we've seen with Isabel. These are proposals, some short terms that we find important to be just considered and accepted, but others will need to have long-term solutions. And we need to have a change with a systemic focus of economic and social justice with new rules. So we truly need and want a sustainable solution with a human development focus, a tax justice focus for regional, national, global levels, and a financial architecture that's focused, that's centered on people, life, human rights, and that contribute and do not undermine, as in many cases, the 2030 agenda and climate agenda. Thank you very much. Thank you, Patricia. I think that this final message is quite clear. So I just reiterate before passing to Juana that will be talking about how human rights obligations propose demands for financial institutions that are international and private players and creditors to face with structural measures the external debt in the context of the pandemic. So Juana, please, you have 10 minutes. Thank you very much, Sergio, and thank you so much for the invitation. I think that the idea of a regional initiative to propose guidelines and tax principles is quite welcome, and it is also quite timely. I'd like to start by adding two aspects that are also a summary of some of the best presentations that came before me. I think that it is very clear out of what we've heard and what we know that all human rights need financial resources, human resources, to be able to protect them and adhere to them. We always say that social, economic, and cultural rights are the ones that need resources, but in practice, we do need resources for all type of human rights. And these resources are required in the immediate, for example, now because of the pandemic, but also long term. The need to connect human rights with tax policy and the best understanding of macroeconomy at the service of people is an essential need for the work in human rights to short, middle, and long term. In other words, we cannot separate, as it has been traditionally done, a human rights discussion from tax policy, macroeconomics aspects, etc. Secondly, the comment that I'd like to add is that, just as our colleagues have said, we are going through a situation where many crises that already existed before COVID have deepened and have met. We have a crisis in our region, an inequality crisis. We have a crisis that has deepened on poverty and extreme poverty, and we also have, once again, a public debt crisis. So this has deepened, facing a global pandemic that has been extremely hard for Latin America and the Caribbean. Now, facing these multiple crises, we also have a scenario which hadn't been seen as complex as now. This scenario finds players such as the IMF, the World Bank, but also other creditors, bilateral creditors, multilateral creditors. I mean, a combination of actors in the framework of an international financial architecture. Some of them may be more known than others.
Algunos menos conocidos y no
others less, but still just as problematic and complicated. So this complexity of actors in terms of debt also proposes, along with all of the crises that have been mentioned, proposes a time at a global and regional and Latin American and Caribbean level, a very hard moment. And from rights point of view, this is a specifically hard situation for people, starting by people that are vulnerable the most and that have been discriminated against the most. And oh, yes, sorry. So I was saying that these are the people, the groups in the population that pay the bill that Patricia was referring some moments ago. And these are also those who suffer from austerity and reduction and flexibilization measures that Isabel was talking about. So this means that behind austerity measures and macroeconomic invoices in terms of tables and estimates, and behind all of that, we're talking about people, concrete people. Among them, we have, of course, retired people, but also women, the informal sector, which is huge, of informal workers in Latin America and the Caribbean, suffering all of the consequences of these multiple crises. And facing this, we have states, but also financial international institutions, development banks, private actors that are private creditors that not necessarily promote solutions, structural, systemic solutions based on human rights. And I want to stress on these perspectives. There are solutions, some of them better than others, that are on the table coming from different creditors. But these creditors that have responsibilities in terms of human rights, these multilateral or bilateral actors that have responsibilities in human rights, is not necessarily promoting the best solutions from a human rights perspective. And in this context, I truly congratulate and salute the proposal of civil society and these principles of tax policy, these guiding principles that take into account most of the work of different human rights mechanisms, United Nations, Inter-American system, and the experience of those who know throughout the region to propose what should be, where the states should go towards, as well as financial institutions, and the multilateral bank, and private creditors. So in this sense, I would like to stress on principle 3, and that one has already been mentioned in the previous presentations when launching these principles. And I want to stress why this principle has so many important vectors in terms of debt. Principle 3 reads, states should ensure that their tax policy is socially just and fair. So in terms of debt, of public debt, of foreign debt, social justice has to do with justice for more disadvantaged populations, for those who are living in poverty, for retired, for girls, boys. But right now it also makes us think about a socially fair tax policy. One of the problems of the foreign debt is that sometimes measures are taken that could be long-term and that could have a certain sense, but that end up being strong for future situations that are not sustainable otherwise, that are not progressive, and that do not respect some of the obligations of human rights in terms of the International Pact on Social Economic rights, as the usage of the most of available resources from a point of view of progressiveness and non-discrimination long term. So I think that principle number 3 also underlies the need that public debt management does not hinder improving conditions so that human rights can be enjoyed. This principle makes a lot of sense, and it's quite linked to existing obligations in terms of human rights. And it's important to add, and as we very well know, Latin America is the region of the world that has ratified the best international human rights instruments, all of the international human rights instruments, with linking it to cultural and social rights. And Other two principles that I'd like to stress, but I don't have enough time to do so, are Principle 7 and talks about the need for tax information to be transparent, participative, inclusive, and it's adhered to accountability. Why? Well, because an important problem with that is that it is not always transparent and information is not only always available for a certain type of debt that could be bilateral, that could have opaque conditions and terms. So this is not according to human rights. So it is essential that information is available in such a way that society and the different organizations can have access to it. And last but not least, principles 10 and 11 that refer to progressiveness and to its counterpart, which is the obligation that states and other actors have of not setting back in terms of human rights. When Isabel talks about austerity, when we talk about this, we are talking about setbacks that are very important and serious that are forbidden according to the International Pact of International Social and Economic Rights and interpretation that has been done in this pact. So setbacks are also the ones that has affected the most vulnerable populations. So I think that I don't have enough time. And I see that Sergio is just telling me that I don't have enough time. Sorry for that. I don't want to add that debt in all of the presentations cannot be understood if we do not understand that on the basis we have obligations that are not new, obligations that have been there for decades in terms of human rights at an international level, that have a counterpart many times in institutional standards and national legislation, and that are there to protect people. Tax policies aim, as principles state, should be adhering and respecting the protection of human rights. Thank you very much. Thank you, Juana. Well, your presentation is quite valuable to stress on this fact because this is not a matter of solidarity, but also a matter of international obligations. And for the interest of countries themselves, for example, the richest ones or private creditors, well, what this pandemic has shown is that no one is saved until everyone is protected in their economic, social, and cultural rights, including the right to health with access to vaccines. And for these, resources are needed, and that is fundamental to release those. To conclude, because we need to start concluding because of the time we have left, I just want to ask of you a final round of answers for these questions. What is the perspectives for states and civil society in the global south, particularly, which is going to be affected the most by this overview that we've seen, act in bloc to demand structural measures? And what are the actions and spaces that will be a priority in this sense? So you have 1 minute, please, so you can share maybe final reflections surrounding these calls to actions, and maybe we can answer in the same order of the panel members. So Daniel, please. Well, I would say I had to debate and discuss the premise of the question. Emerging countries are seeing just the beginning of something that we are also going to see in developed countries in a couple of years. I mean, all of economic stimulus measures that have been taken, for example, in Europe and the US, are going to start to be eliminated in a couple of years. And for example, perspectives in that sense in the European Union are quite concerning. So something that I would add here is there is an importance to coordinate with civil society in the global south as well as in developed countries on the understanding that this is a world crisis, and the lack of concrete actions to help emerging countries right now will have very serious consequences: public health, safety, security, migration for developed countries. And the concern is that we are wasting time, and every day that goes by and that we do not take measures to help people in this crisis, then the problem is going to turn bigger and bigger and less manageable. Thank you so much, Danielle, for talking about the systemic and global character and also the affectations on the richest countries. This is fundamental. Isabel, please. Well, emphasizing what Danielle has said, that it's very right. I mean, a coordinated response among countries will facilitate a world recovery and fulfilling and adhering to human rights. But right now, for different reasons that we know won't happen. So, from the citizens' point of view, I always think this: it is very important to foster this national dialogue and conversation. These macroeconomic decisions cannot be taken behind closed doors because they impact the lives of millions of people in a country. They impact their human rights. So they have to be discussed publicly in a national discussion, and we can see the consequences of one solution or another. Because if not, the easiest thing would be taking measures that won't go along with human rights. So it is very important to demand this is part of good governability of international conventions approved by all of the countries. So it is not as hard. You know, it is not hard to ask for this. Thank you, Isabel. Patricia, please. Thank you, Sergio. Well, I'd love for Latin American governments to join their voices and to have demands for the region in global spaces, in G20, in the IMF, that could have unified voices in terms of debt, in terms of our liquidity needs, the special drawing rights. And it's just putting a small input, you know, but at the same time, it is an effort that's coming from a long, long time, you know, which is having an integration such as Latin American integration from our countries for our regional integration, a coordination in access to funding, to fair funding, concessionary one in tax matters, coordinating to prevent downwards problems, but also productively speaking, in many aspects, we are exporters of raw material. But if we had a synergy and a coordination among countries, we could have an initiative, a regional initiative that was quite stronger and of a direct benefit for all of our countries. Thank you so much. Thank you. So we conclude with Juana. Please, Juana, go ahead. Thank you, Sergio. Well, I would love to remind you that international cooperation, among countries, is also accepting human rights obligations. I believe that some of the initiatives that have been proposed here in Patricia's table from civil society make a lot of sense for the entire global south. And part of civil society actions, if I may, can also be achieving integration between Africa, that's going through very similar problems, and Latin America, to apply some pressure for systemic reforms to international debt architecture. This is one of the goals of the independent expert, Yufen Liko. I work with her, of the independent expert on debt and human rights. And she talks about proposing on reforms that are more systemic. And of course, the participation of civil society for this discussion, that's not only a national discussion, but that's also one between actors of civil society in different regions. And I find that this is a possible and important and necessary goal. Thank you. Thank you so much, Juan. I know that there are still a lot of questions out there, and there's a lot to still say, you know. Thank you so much for your presentations, but this is not it. Today at 1 p.m. Colombia, 3 p.m. Brazil and Argentina, we will have a Twitter opportunity in Twitter space, so we can continue with this debate. And Karina Patricio will be there, and and Mario Valencia from Latindad. So we know that for our panel members it's quite late for European times, but thank you so much for being here. And what you have been said here is going to be key for the deliberation that we will have in this Twitter space. So last but not least, I would like to close asking our rapporteur to show the graphic summary of this debate. And it is also going to be available in this initiative's webpage. It is an amazing work of art in terms of summary capacity. We would like to thank all of the panel members and Rayleigh, and we invite you to continue this week that just started. Thank you very much.